When Street Fighter V was originally released in 2016, fans of the franchise had eagerly anticipated the then next installment since the days of Street Fighter IV, and had assumed Capcom would have treated the fifth installment of the iconic series of fighting games with just as much focus on integrity as the fourth. However, this was not the case, as from information now known, Capcom intentionally censored certain details of the game throughout its lifespan due to dynamics of the game that weren't completed from development, perceived fan service, or even religious references. When Street Fighter V was announced up until its release, gamers were in awe of the technology being used for the gameplay. It was a literal feat of engineering from the days of Street Fighter II to Street Fighter III, then to Street Fighter IV, on to the release of Street Fighter V. Gamers were excited to play as the iconic characters with the then most advanced gaming technology. Critics were anticipating a wide range of a then modernized roster to select from. This was not the case, as when the game was released there was an intentionally small amount of playable characters to choose from. Gamers of the time complained about the lack of diversity when in online matches, as there were many mirror match scenarios. Capcom intentionally misled players and critics, often censoring and belittling claims of poor character choice, eventually Outwitch admitted to the intentionally small roster of playable characters, as this was a ploy by Capcom later to force players into buying the seasonal battle pass. The game was considered a failure by critics and gamers, and even Capcom couldn't censor the fact as the game's reputation was poor until the game was redesigned, rebranded, and re-released as Street Fighter V Championship Edition. Cammy White's one-piece green suit was an iconic aspect of the character, and it was the aspect of fan service that Capcom openly admitted to and never did anything about. From Street Fighter II, then to Street Fighter III, then to Street Fighter IV, and the wider gaming community assumed that the sword would have been implemented for Street Fighter V. Initial footage showed Cammy making her entrance with particular angles on display for the player to see, but in actual gameplay footage, the angles of her entrance as to what could be seen were different. Claims of censorship had her making entrances in a different way. Capcom argued that the game was still being fine-tuned, so the change in display for Cammy when she made her entrance as to what was seen and what was not were due to developmental points of view, and not necessarily censorship. In Street Fighter III, Rainbow Mika was known for slapping her posterior before executing certain attacks. It was a comical and innocently lewd attack that the Japanese and American gaming demographics of the time knew and did not necessarily care much for. Capcom has selected Rainbow Mika as a character for Street Fighter V and had her with a whole range of attacks. Early footage showed Mika performing her iconic attack, and gamers were excited for such a comedic attack to actually be brought into the modern era of Street Fighter. But upon actual selection of the character, the angles of the attack were censored than what was depicted in initial footage. Capcom later released statements mentioning that the changes were needed and reflective of their policies for Street Fighter V. Editors later modded the camera angles back to the original views, and players were then able to experience Rainbow Mika's attacks as how they were originally shown and envisioned for. Jury was introduced in Street Fighter IV but became a character reacted to positively by the Street Fighter gaming community during the era of Street Fighter V. Her default costume of the time had her with a full amount of cleavage being exposed. Even in Japanese final releases of the game, the examples of breast exposure were minimalized, despite the fact that later skins for Jury would be released with much more revealing or suggestive depictions for players. The fact that the defaulted skin was censored was an example that Capcom later admitted were correct. When Capcom released the Thailand stage for Street Fighter V, it was a reflection of an iconic aspect of Street Fighter history, and players were excited to see it with modernized graphics, and an interpretation for a whole new generation of players. In its original aspect, it reflected Buddhism and was an important depiction for the overall lore for the franchise. Buddhism was and still is a key religion and ideology for Northeast Asia, but despite that, it originally featured Islamic chanting. The stage was removed from play selection as the stage would be later put back into circulation with the Islamic references removed. There were other examples of various sorts of censorship, but these were some of the most discussed in terms of censorship for Street Fighter V.